So this one is a weird one, but I'm a weirdo, so welcome to the show. So I was having a conversation with my friend, and he said that he overheard this parent in a grocery store asking their kid, "How are you?" And he thought that that was a weird way to talk to a child about their emotional state, because it was talking to them as if they were a little adult. And I was saying, well, in a certain way, asking children about their feelings at all is new. And the fact that we actually have a parenting system that tries to pay attention to the emotions of children, if you put it in historical context, is a blip on the radar screen. And he was saying, fair enough, but we exist within this blip. And that the issue with asking a child about their emotions and expecting them to respond the way an adult would to a question such as, "How are you?" is that it teaches the kid to fake it. It teaches them the form and the structure of linguistic exchange with which adults discuss their feelings without necessarily allowing or affording them the opportunity to feel and maybe find a novel, expressive vehicle through language or otherwise to show what's going on in their internal world. It's like you're asking the child to come into the adult world and to find meaning there, to find meaning in whatever word is within the acceptable spectrum of how an adult would answer the question, "How are you?" And that is supposed to be meaningful in and of itself. But what it actually does train, and does so in the way that we all as adults are probably currently trained, is that it teaches us to find meaning in the structure or the form of this type of exchange about our feelings, but not find meaning necessarily in the content. So we place a lot of value on someone asking us how we're doing, and we place value on the word that we respond with and how free we feel to answer. But we place a lot less expressive opportunity and therefore less emotional value and stake in the content itself. So it happens a lot where someone's like, "Hey, how are you doing?" And you're like, "I'm so tired," right? But because of the form that's been taught to you about how to express when you're tired is, sure, it's fine just to say you're tired, but you can't actually show you're tired. And so adult interactions exist on this spectrum of intimacy between what we say we're feeling within the known linguistic exchange structures that we're trained in to actually being able to show those emotions and be connected to our internal world in front of others. And that's how you know when you're really close with someone. When you're not just saying, "I'm tired," but you actually can like plop down on their couch and be like, "I'm exhausted." And then not kind of muster up that giddy exchange that we think we need to have for everyone with like a million confetti emoticons and exclamation points coming out of our fucking ears. And he was saying that you can see how this starts really young with kids, because what we're training them for and asking about their feelings in this very adultized way is really just compartmentalization, is really just coming to appreciate someone asking how you're feeling while compartmentalizing the feelings themselves. And I really deeply enjoyed this whole conversation because I spent a lot of time thinking about early childhood development and the development between perceptual cognitive interfaces between our inner world and the external world. And especially what it means to be a parent and to raise a child, and what it means to be a child and have a parent in our current historical moment. Because it's almost as if now time is speeding transcendent of the material. And what I mean by that is that the material reality that we currently exist within, the speed at which that changes and transforms is accelerating. And we all know this. You know, it's like before, like if you had a city, it was that idea of let us think that when we build forever. And now we know when we build, let us think that we build temporarily. And you think about a child coming of age in this era where cities are constantly changing, where they're malleable organisms ever capable of being rearranged, or existing in digital spaces where anything can be created and fall in a moment, and where even their identities are becoming something that you can shift and fabricate and chameleon evolve, live through multiple lives and multiple selves over the course of a year. So as the material structure, and not only the material, but also the relational fields that we use, the understandings that we have, all of this, the stacked levels that make society changing so fast means that parents will no longer have wisdom to pass down to their children that can be one-to-one correlated to material reality, right? I mean, I know this, like, even in terms of, like, how my parents applied for jobs versus how I have to apply for jobs, or what college is like for, what applying to college was like for me versus how it's gonna be for my kids, or if they'll even be college. Like, all of these things that are just practical aspects. You know, what'll happen to banks? What will currency be? What will a country be? What will borders be? I mean, these questions that are so fundamental to the type of guidance that a parent would shepherd their children through can no longer be counted on to stay the same. And it got me thinking about if, you know, we are preparing to interact with the world and with each other and with future generations, this question of, can we find the energy of the wisdom within the legacy of material reality that we could apply to present circumstances at the level of essence or pattern or general orientation? And can we start working now to be able to recognize those patterns and energetic assemblage points within the lessons that we are learning, and what it is that we are consciously harvesting from our experience in the sort of consensus reality, materiality details of our life now, in order to be able to share it in the future. Because what do we have? What can we find to pass down to our children who will come to occupy a cognition and a world so vastly beyond our imagining? And so vastly beyond our imagining precisely if we are not able to see the underlying energies, dynamics, and patterns within it. And I guess that's why I'm sort of trying to set up the question in a way that's stacked towards my own point, because I think the way to live now in terms of what we will be able to translate to future generations and what will help us be able to live through times of tremendous change in the very fabric of life and society and relationship is this ability for pattern recognition, is the ability to recognize history and dynamics repeating themselves as the roles and details transform. And that within that, because of the acceleration, there needs to be a necessary orientation towards change, an openness to change, and with the hope that that openness will make us that more receptive to finding tools that will help us navigate it. Because the change certainly does seem unavoidable. And the more lucid that we can get in the moment of change, it's a little bit like the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, that we're receiving these progressive shocks. You know, the entire administration of the United States right now, I think, is purely based on just keeping our fucking sphincters knotted up as tight as they possibly can with fear-mongering and hate-mongering and the next horrendous act that our like entire root chakra is just in panic, and we never get a moment out of that sort of survivalistic brain to take even the time to consider long-term strategies or even have the wherewithal to change the frame so that we're not just protesting what it is that they are doing, but that we are creating a strategy of our own and have the ability to implement it. And I'm gonna make another video about speed and urgency, so I won't get into that right now. But I think that we've been trained to see change as chaos. We've been trained to see things that appear on the surface to be new as new. And that this is what keeps us completely disempowered from being able to make those long-term strategies and being able to become lucid in the dream of the present and the future and the times that we live in, and stay grounded to make decisions. So that it could be that seeing these things as patterns instead of constant chaos could be part of that flip, which would allow us to be able to breathe more calmly and make more long-term plans and strategies and know how to face this stuff when it comes up. Because it would be a shame to lose the lessons of history by becoming hypnotized into believing that this moment is so completely novel that there's no commonality. And if anything, our technology and our intellectual spheres of philosophy and social theory might be accelerating very rapidly, but I believe that our emotional bodies and those deep patterns of how we relate to ourselves and each other are actually moving more slowly than that. We can all talk a big game about, how things should be or about whatever. But a lot of times, when I really check in with myself, my ideas are in a different place than my ability to respond when things come up that actually trigger me emotionally. I can talk a lot about patriarchy and internalized oppression, but that doesn't change wanting male attention, for example, or the male gaze when I'm in a certain situation. It doesn't change a lot of the dynamics that I still have inside me around that. And so slowing down the story about what actual reality is as different from the worlds that we create in the collective sphere of verbal exchange with each other has been helpful for me in being able to locate myself actually and emotionally when shit comes up. That might be kind of abstract, but I think my point is just, at the level of the emotional body, humans might not be so different from previous generations in the past. And children, even though we tell them that the world is made up of ideas or teach them ideas with which to navigate it, they might also not be so different at the level of their emotional body than we were, or than our parents were. At least to start.
Especially if that's not what we're teaching them.
Because there's a lot of stories and romanticized stories about what it was like to be a little kid, and most of us have that function of memory that erases that actual experience. When I get in touch really with what being a little kid was like for me, it was often very lonely and very sad. And this is very different, I think, than the world that we create for children to live in. That's trying to impose itself onto them based on its own assumptions. It's saying, oh, we're going to give you all these puffy, soft felt stuffed animals to play with and teach you these numbers based on these like bouncy games. And we don't necessarily know what it feels like for those kids when they're on the schoolyard, or what it is that they feel comfortable telling their parents or not. But I feel like I could just go and go all the time. But my point is that we don't want those lessons of history to be lost. And we also don't want them to similarly become out of step with present time reality. And so the question is, again, in this underlying pattern, what has been left out of history that could be included that would be able to help us find a more accurate pattern? Because we all know history has been written by the victor and written during a time of such intense patriarchy and, imperialism, colonization, etc., that it does not include an emotional level of reality. For example, it does not include the psyche, it does not include that phenomenon or those people with which it considered outside the bounds of valid and valued. And so now there are some scholars that talk about this queering of history, and what they mean by that is about letting in all of these voices to contribute to the narrative of what has come before that were previously left out. So what does it mean to talk to people of color? What does it mean to talk to actual queers? What does it mean to include the story of nature, the victims of capitalism that did not make it into the final creation of an urban plan, for example, and that this means both things that we can point to in material reality, but also this kind of wholeness of the psyche and this wholeness of the collective. And that when we include these other voices, we inherently challenge the normal dichotomous way with which we understand ourselves and tell stories about ourselves, right? Like if we include all of the voices that led to something coming into being, it becomes much more difficult to have clear lines about right and wrong and us and them. And we get to see this organic ecosystemic vision of the way that things come to be that involve a lot of things eating themselves and, you know, a lot of nuances in what it is that actually ends up influencing how something comes to be, and a lot of dominance of ideas in terms of who gets to share and be a part of it and how. This is a side note, but I guess just for completeness, it's coming to me now that in addition to the things that I think are good skills to learn right along there with pattern recognition and openness to change, and what was the third one? Oh, this ability to hold multiple perspectives is one, like self-care, right? How to take care of yourself in the face of things like speed and, you know, chaos. And the other thing that would be part of self-care would be some kind of faith in the process, which I think is maybe one of the most undervalued and overlooked aspects of self-care that has really changed my entire life, was the difference between finding some kind of faith in what's happening. And I really think that right now, if I didn't have that faith in it, faith, you know, in the sense it's not hope, because hope to me feels like it's grounded in something. There's something giving you hope. But for me, faith is reference pointless. That faith simply is. And that faith is an internal state of being that helps us dance with what's happening. And I really think that if I didn't have that right now, I would probably lose my mind. If all I had was scientific materialism and consensus reality and this picture of what it means to be human and this short time scale of how much time I consider when I look at current events, I would absolutely be going crazy. I would go crazy. I would go fucking crazy right now. Because if you just look through that lens of like right now, scientific materialism, the media is telling us what's true, you could go nuts. And it's only when you queer your own holistic picture, only when you seek out alternative sources, connect with nature, value your direct sensory experience, see things in broad scales of time, connect to other aspects of your own humanity and your own consciousness capacity. I'm saying you, but I mean me. Have I been able to truly deeply feel that faith, that something bigger than I can understand is happening, and I am part of a moment in a process, and I don't know where it's leading, but that the life on this planet is doing something, and I am a part of it. And the more that I can just find out my part and play my part, you know, be my fucking self to the best that I can be, then that is all I need to do for the greater system of which I'm a part to do its thing. And that, of course, involves a lot of action. and a lot of aligned action. And then a good amount of self-care and some of that wild faith. They have this idea in education theory called zones of proximal development, which is basically just like you can't know what you don't know. You know, like if you're trying to learn calculus and you only know whatever comes before calculus, and your teacher says, what do you still need to learn? And you don't know fucking calculus. Like, you have no idea what you still need to learn. It's outside the zone of your proximal development. And I think this correlates to our moment right now, because we cannot know the name for what it is that we are lacking within the system if no one in the system has it or has seen it. So what we get are these generational gaps where what we transfer through the generations is a lot of our own assumptions and self-ignorances and personal biases and unconscious perpetuation. You know, like raising children within systems of punishment and reward, because that's what we grew up in and because it works. You know, like, I don't know if you've ever been with a crying 2-year-old and you're trying to get them to go from A to B and you can't grab them and just force them to go where you're trying to go. And so it really does work a lot better to say, hey, come with me here and I'll get you an ice cream cone, you know? And I don't hold it against any parent who does that, or hey, come here or else, which maybe, you know, is just the other side of the same thing, even though it looks so much more brutal. But the fact is that we might not know what comes outside of that. It's outside of our zone of development. But the more that we see our role as passing down very strict ways of understanding how to navigate the world, the more that we pass down something like, you leave the house when you're 18 and you should be able to go to college or get a job, which is, if you look at the historical record, relatively recent and relatively arbitrary. And if you look especially at the last few generations that tried to do that since the very short period of American affluence, so that was maybe the case. You know, everyone who I know who's 18, yeah, if you have a really hard up situation, probably your parents are going to be like, get out of my house or get a job when you're 18 or go to college if you're lucky. But most, because of the way society is created now and class stratified now, can't necessarily do that. You know, you have all these people who like come home after college or like can't even afford rent if they're working full-time in the city where they're living in. So these rules about how to navigate through society that were true in previous generations may not be true anymore. And the more that we stick to them, instead of being open and actually observing the change happening around us, the more inaccurate our perceptions of the situation are. And, you know, I think throughout any time, all parents have had to face the fact that they may never fully understand their children, but I do think that we can try. And that in trying to understand our children, it also is something about trying to understand the world as it is. And that in giving, or at least attempting to create a situation with tools that help children come to understand themselves, we give them the tools for greater navigating the world that they will come to live in. This is for parents and also for teachers and anyone interacting with children. My God. You know, like, I know I always had a very difficult time in school. Like, I was always smart, but I was never smart in a way that worked with the system. And I rebelled, you know, I was like a super rebel. And in a certain way, I was always asking my teachers to be creative in how they handled me. Like, they would give us an assignment to write 2 pages on this in a very sort of textbook kind of way, and I would turn in like a creative writing 10-page thing and then get upset when they didn't grade me very well on it. Like, oh, they didn't see me, they don't appreciate me, kind of thing. And I can see now I was really asking for the system to change and doing so kind of sideways, you know, instead of saying first to the teacher, like, hey, this assignment You know, I have a different idea for how to do it. Would that be okay? What do I still need to do to fit within the requirements? What do you need to cover your ass? I just did my thing, you know, and then got all upset when it wasn't accepted. But this sort of mirrors my whole childhood, because I always was trying to do things really differently and kind of like wiggle magic my way through the system, and then was very hurt when the system didn't respond positively. And I think that the story I took from all these experiences was that there was no room in the system for me, that I didn't fit, that I was like always an outcast or whatever. And because I kept going at things sideways, it became reinforced for me emotionally that this really was the case, that I really would not be accepted within the canonized institutions as they are, and that I was, you know, a weirdo. And really, you know, just caused like a lot of emotional labor, I'm sure, for everybody. And I can see now that all those lacks that I felt in my relationships as a kid growing up with other kids, with adults, with just coming to terms with the world as it is, that was so overwhelming, kind of coalesced and became all of the sort of fantasies and high dreams that I had for romance when I was a kid. You know, like ever since I can remember, I had this fantasy that I would meet this magic person, that this magic person would come into my life, and that they would recognize me as magic, and they'd say, oh my God, you're magic, I'm magic, let's go away to Magic Land and we'll live with all the magic people forever. Kind of like, you know, this was a little after my time, but that Harry Potter thing, where it's like, I see you, you're different, let's go to a world where things are different. And, you know, people might put all of those unmet needs in whatever realm of fantasy that they find most appealing, but I found that romantic fantasies, or our romantic lives, are one of the places where we're kind of allowed to be dreamy. And so a lot of these unmet desires get placed there. And me, you know, I had no word for what I felt like I was missing. And I think, strangely enough, you know, growing up in San Francisco, it was even weirder to be feeling so unmet in a place where it seemed like so many other people had found it. Like all these people would run far and wide from whatever small town place and wherever, and they'd come to San Francisco, to the Bay Area, and they'd be like, yeah, it's all happening, it's finally happening for me, like, this is it. And to be growing up in that place and to feel so at a loss was really confusing for me. And ultimately, I had to go out of this world completely to find what it is that I was looking for. I had to go to other countries. I had to go into psychedelics. I had to go into like my own complete, you know, psycho-spiritual breakdown, breakthrough experience to find and finally get a taste of what it was that I had been wanting. I had to go whole hog into a lot of different romantic relationships, to the far ends of the earth, deep into places of my consciousness, on like whatever psychedelic drug I could imagine, you know, try out a million different things to get just one taste of what it was that I'd been missing and wanting that whole time. And really, when I think about it, traveling didn't do the trick, because I'd been so heavily indoctrinated into the world of adults. You know, I grew up in this very political, radical home where everything that we learned about how to perceive reality was in terms of politics and the social sphere. And so even when I went to other countries, you know, even I'd be in Nepal, and the geopolitical structure of society was the primary filter with which I was perceiving my experience. And so it became what was mapped on one-to-one with everything that I was seeing. So even when I went to other places, what I saw was the conditioning that had been taught to me. And it didn't matter where I went. You know, I wrote this whole paper about like the oppressive nature of Buddhism in Nepal, because that's all I could see when I was there. And I still, you know, see the geopolitical map in places where I go, but it is one of the filters that I take in information with, and not the only one, right? Like, I had to learn how to use multiple interpretations of reality in order to feel met inside, and in order to feel the freedom to be able to create my own cognitive map that would allow me to take in information in a way that was satisfying. And that I only learned through direct experience on things like psychedelic drugs, or really intense emotional states caused by relationships, or friends, who taught me different ways, and ultimately my own transcendent experiences. And I have a lot of love for my parents. Sometimes I'll talk about just the effect that it had learning about political reality so young, and one of my moms will be like, "Oh, how could we have done it better?" And I don't think it's about doing it better. We all got handed the hand that we did, and I think I got a very, very fortunate one. But within the gift and opportunity of having the hand we have, of being able to actually see the cards that are ours and only see those, is that we can fine-tune and thin slice how things affected us and trace the map in order to kind of think about this future-oriented question about raising our own children, and that maybe we are dreaming ourselves into being the parents we want to be by learning about the parents we did have and learning the parents we would want to have. That in some way it's like the DNA is learning itself backwards. That DNA kind of refracts itself through time, the same way AI does. And so it's learning by filling in the gaps and course correcting the things that led to its expression through time backwards, with each iteration filling in those gaps and lacunas, those holes, those things that were outside the zone of proximal development of what came before. And so that way, in pattern, if not in material reality or in linear time, we are our parents, and our children will be our parents, the same way that we may come to a fulcrum point in the generations where we become our parents' parents. And so when I think about being the child of my child, right, of being humbled, right, and learning from them, when I think of being kind of ushered into a world that is in the very near future, that they will be more adept and familiar with navigating than I will. Like, our children will raise themselves in a reality where the main thing that is structuring interaction is not physical, and instead is composed of an amount of non-local information exchange that is, I think, truly unfathomable to us, who will be able to live in a multiplicity of self-conceptions beyond what we could ever dream of, just by the inherent balkanization and possibility of human identity and the ego structure that is evolving as capable of holding it. There's a liberation of art in the age of mechanical production, as opposed to Walter Benjamin, who was simply bemoaning the fact that things were no longer culturally and contextually specific. But there was a huge liberation in that. And this is opening up into an entirely new realm, an entirely new dimension as we enter art in the age of digital reproduction. So coming back, long circle, to this idea of, can we translate that wisdom into the language of our times as all that is solid melts into air? And can we ourselves find the imprint, the pattern, the essence of what is still relevant in the traces of the vapor that remains? Just to kind of riff for a second on what I was saying before, the art of the self is transforming its fundamental ontoepistemology before our very eyes. The very medium of art that we would call the self is fracturing and fractaling, losing its solidity. You know, even what we have currently as individuality is a product of very recent history, right? Like individual selfhood was born by and in the realization of a certain lack inherent to tightly woven socio-cultural societies coming into contact with shifts in technological production, social organization, and the exchange of information, and how that fed back into perceptual consciousness. Like individuality itself came into being within a social ecosystem, where the expectation of parents was that their progeny would replicate their same form according to the signifiers categorized as meaningful and stratified by class, gender, race, etc. within those systems, right? Like the sons of bakers would be bakers. The sons of noblemen would be noblemen. The daughters of noblemen would marry noblemen. The daughters of bakers would marry bakers and be the wives of bakers. I mean, that's what life and self was. And especially during this time where you went from being a child directly to being an adult and working around the age of 11 or 12, or, you know, went from being a child to being a wife around the age of 11 or 12. And so individuality or individuation is a reaction against this kind of assumed path of replication. It's a rebellion against its intrinsic narcissism that many parents continue to display through different classes and cultures, and in more subtle ways that reflect the process of individuation and yet perpetuate this idea that our children should follow in our same footsteps. And strangely, now liberated to varying degrees from this overtly or covertly predetermined, restricted life path, and in the face of this multitude of options, or the myth thereof, and the burden of having to choose without much clearly and directly articulated historical precedent for how to proceed in unknown and ever-changing circumstances, or precedent for even what the art of the self is now within this new medium of cognition and reality that makes up a person moving through a particular time. We're now involved in a new kind of narcissistic paralysis, right? Like before, we were stuck being bakers if our parents were a baker, being the wives of bakers if our parents was a baker, whereas now we're stuck, I think, not so much by the overwhelming need for choice, and not so much by the shifts in society that require greater specialization and therefore longer gestation periods in order to be ready to really enter the social sphere. I think part of the paralysis is that the bedrock of individuality itself is crumbling in terms of how previous notions of individuation no longer suffice to insulate and support a person through these times. So we're using the technology that we have and the kind of like savvy that we have to put together pictures of who we are on job applications, on Instagram, when we introduce ourselves to each other, or whatever, that fulfill previous notions of what a successful person and what a successful life fulfillment would have been, especially around things of like upward mobility, right? Like everyone wants to look like they have money, like they're making money, like they're doing things successfully, or like that they're getting up in life from where they started. So whereas before it was like you had to live an ordinary life, you couldn't do anything else. Now it's like you have to live an extraordinary life, you can't do anything else. And both had very severe ostracizing social implications. But all of this is happening while the bedrock of the self is potentially crumbling. But maybe there was never a bedrock at all, because the self or a self was a phenomena that emerged and developed out of a particular historical field. It's a cognitive development that emerged out of a particular stage of history. And maybe now what we're experiencing is a new one, like a new cognitive property is emerging in terms of how we understand the self or a self that will come to replace what we currently hold to be that thing. And it's like, Terence McKenna says, the future has arrived, have you? And maybe the challenge particular to this present moment of the future and to arriving in the present as the future is the change of what it means to be a you. And that the ability to develop a sensitivity to be able to feel what is solid in the you, as so much around us, so much inside us, and so much of the very material psychosomatic stuff that makes up life changes, requires different senses altogether and completely different understandings with which to approach things. Like, not just to be able to find the solidity of you, but to be able to feel and appreciate the air of you as these cycles change and morph. The future has always been unknown, and the only difference now, in a very overt way, is that the future lives in the present, is impregnating the present in every moment, and that the past is always with us, still, which maybe hasn't changed, and that the past continues to impregnate the future. And so no matter what the era or the time signature of the cycles of the generations, no matter what that is or has or will mean, have always been the parents and the children held in the crux of the moment and at the mercy of our own zones of proximal development, from which our children will come to feel and know and learn their own lack, and try to fulfill it. Sort of praxily looping with the systems that are, and paving what the systems will be. And because the future is unknown, I'm not sure what or how the patterns that we can come to recognize beneath the obvious gross material reality will continue to play out. But that may be attuning to that level of how they might be playing out, partially and in new and updated ways, might help give us some foothold in the times that are coming and some common way to talk to our children at all.